Moon. Right. And then there's that. What planet is that?
That is not a planet. That, says the United States, is a giant Chinese spy balloon.
I am here in Billings, Montana.
Floating some 60,000 feet above the state of Montana.
It's been there stationary for about the last 35 minutes.
In fact, the US has been tracking the balloon for several days. And this close-up reveals the hardware attached to one side that China claims is simply tracking the weather. A meteorological airship, they insist, that's simply been blown off course. But the US begs to differ.
We know that it's a surveillance balloon, and I'm not going to be able to be more specific than that. We do know that the balloon has violated U.S. airspace and international law, which is unacceptable.
Of course, China has its own version of the story. In a tweet, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was quoted as saying the airship was used for mainly meteorological purposes. Affected by the westerlies and with limited self-steering capability, it deviated far from its planned course. Conservative American TV networks were quick to show just how far.
Biden allowing on-demand access to our U.S. airspace is dangerous.
My concern is that the federal government obviously doesn't know what's in that balloon. Is that bioweapons in that balloon? Did that balloon take off from Wuhan? We don't know anything about that balloon.
The Pentagon says it does know the airship poses no physical or military threat to people on the ground. It had considered shooting the balloon down while it was over a sparsely populated area of Montana yesterday, but decided against it because of the risk of falling debris. Pressed today on whether that option is now off the table, the Pentagon wouldn't commit.
So at this stage, what I can tell you is, again, we're reviewing options. I'm not going to go into more specifics than that. And when and if there's any updates to provide, we'll let you know.
It's been ruled out, shooting.
Again, we're monitoring it and we're reviewing options.
The balloon debacle is the latest ratcheting up of tensions between the US and China. Joe Biden held his first face-to-face meeting with President Xi Jinping in Bali in November, aimed at stabilizing what had become an increasingly difficult relationship. The two held blunt discussions about Russia and China's increasingly aggressive stance towards Taiwan, like these live firing exercises over the island last summer, a factor in the US recently building up its military presence in the region. The plan had been for the Secretary of State Antony Blinken to travel to Beijing this month to further build bridges. But in the wake of the balloon incursion, that trip was abruptly cancelled today. And with it, a strong message to Beijing that will do nothing to ease tensions between the two superpowers, that the balloon's incursion over America was an unacceptable and irresponsible incident. Well, China is continuing to insist that this incident was a force majeure. In other words, it happened due to circumstances beyond its control. The Republicans here, though, are using this incident as a stick to beat Joe Biden with, saying it's another example of his weakness towards China. The leader of the Republicans, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, saying today, calling for an immediate briefing with the White House and saying that China's brazen disregard for US sovereignty is a destabilizing action that must be addressed, and President Biden cannot be silent. President Biden, however, has been silent on this incident today. He was asked to comment on it by a reporter, but he said nothing. But clearly the Pentagon is, as you saw in my piece, trying to downplay the incident, almost saying it sees no threat to Americans militarily or physically because of the balloon above. But clearly this is all about optics. Joe Biden has to be seen to be acting, hence him yanking this trip by Antony Blinken. There's no date has been put in for the diary for when this trip might happen, and also hence the Pentagon today not ruling out the possibility that they still might yet to decide to blow this thing out of the sky.
Siobhan, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to Dr. Ariana Mastro, Foreign and Defence Policy Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute think tank. I began by asking her why China would use a spy balloon.
Well, generally speaking, there are a variety of ways that countries collect information
on other countries. You have satellites. You also have what is often referred to as theater assets, so airplanes, ships, and in this case, a balloon that does a similar thing. They all have their benefits and they all have their downsides. Things like satellites, you can't position them, you can't control them. They have to be over exactly what you want to see. They can be susceptible to weather, while something like an aircraft or ship, you can get right to where you need to be. Also, something like this balloon is much more low observable. Countries know when satellites pass over. Countries can track. Airplanes and ships, balloons are harder to track.
Secretary of State Blinken has cancelled his visit, or at least postponed it, to China. How bad is this for US-China relations?
It's hard to think of a way that US-China relations are going to get any more tense than they are. Many believe that if the two countries engaged more and had more interaction, that we could come to terms with some of the areas of tension. I'm not one of those people. I think we're primarily in the situation we're in because we have conflicting interests. Primarily right now, China will not promise not to use force to take Taiwan, and the United States is very concerned that that might happen. So for all the dialogue, probably you wouldn't have gotten any sort of deliverables. It would have just been the case that we could say we tried our best to ameliorate the situation, but there's very little that can be done.
And just this week, we've also seen a leaked memo from a US general saying his gut told him the US would be at war with China in 2025. Given that and today's developments, it is looking slightly alarming.
I would say that my understanding of General Minahan's memo was primarily to motivate his troops. There needs to be a greater sense of urgency in the United States about the challenge. And that's largely because defense moves slowly. So even if the United States Defense Department decides it needs more bases, it needs more munitions, it needs better platforms, it can take years and years to get there.
The US administration is under pressure internally. You have senior Republicans demanding that this balloon should be shot down. What's the reaction to that likely to be?
The most important thing about those discussions is the fact that China is going to interpret Secretary Blinken's postponement, not as a result of any poor behavior on their part, but as the result of U.S. domestic politics. They're likely to see this as a move of the Biden administration facing pressure from at home, deciding it was not a great time to talk to China. So while we might hope that the decision by Secretary Blinken to postpone the visit could influence Chinese behavior or policies towards a less belligerent direction, because they blame other factors besides themselves, that change is unlikely to happen. One of the reasons I was surprised that Secretary Blinken canceled his trip is because it's been a talking point for decades of the Chinese that surveillance activities close to their territory, close to any country's territory, is disrespectful and threatening. And they've used those talking points to try to convince the United States to reduce such activities in the South China Sea and East China Sea. In my view, it doesn't seem particularly helpful for the United States to try to elevate this issue as a talking point, because it does also potentially limit the types of activities the United States wants to engage in to ensure its own security.
Dr. Ariana Mastro, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.